Part 4. You will hear a zoology student giving a presentation on the process of moving wild elephants to a new reserve, known as translocation. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
For my presentation today, I want to tell you about how groups of elephants have been moved and settled in new reserves. This is known as translocation and has been carried out in Malawi in Africa in recent years. The reason this is being done is because of overpopulation of elephants in some areas. Overpopulation is a good problem to have, and not one we tend to hear about very often. In Malawi's Majeti National Park, the elephant population had been wiped out by poachers, who killed the elephants for their ivory. But in 2003, the park was restocked, and effective law enforcement was introduced. Since then, not a single elephant has been poached. In this safe environment, the elephant population boomed. Breeding went so well that there were more elephants than the park could support. This led to a number of problems. Firstly, there was more competition for food, which meant that some elephants were suffering from hunger. As there was a limit to the amount of food in the national park, some elephants began looking further afield. Elephants were routinely knocking down fences around the park, which then had to be repaired at a significant cost. To solve this problem, the decision was made to move dozens of elephants from Majeti National Park to Nkotakota Wildlife Park, where there were no elephants. But, obviously, attempting to move significant numbers of elephants to a new home 300 kilometres away is quite a challenge. So, how did this translocation process work in practice? Elephants were moved in groups of between 8 and 20, all belonging to one family. Because relationships are very important to elephants, they all had to be moved at the same time. A team of vets and park rangers flew over the park in helicopters and targeted a group, which were rounded up and directed to a designated open plain. The vets then used darts to immobilize the elephants. This was a tricky maneuver, as they not only had to select the right dose of tranquilizer for different-sized elephants, but they had to dart the elephants as they were running around. This also had to be done as quickly as possible, so as to minimize the stress caused. As soon as the elephants began to flop onto the ground, the team moved in to take care of them. To avoid the risk of suffocation, the team had to make sure none of the elephants were lying on their chests, because their lungs could be crushed in this position. So, all the elephants had to be placed on their sides. One person stayed with each elephant while they waited for the vets to do checks. It was very important to keep an eye on their breathing. If there were fewer than 6 breaths per minute, the elephant would need urgent medical attention. Collars were fitted to the matriarch in each group so their movements could be tracked in their new home. Measurements were taken of each elephant's tusks. Elephants with large tusks would be at greater risk from poachers, and also of their feet. The elephants were then taken to a recovery area before being loaded onto trucks and transported to their new home. The elephants translocated to Nkota settled in very well, and the project has generally been accepted to have been a huge success, and not just for the elephants. Employment prospects have improved enormously, contributing to rising living standards for the whole community. Poaching is no longer an issue, as former poachers are able to find more reliable sources of income. In fact, many of them volunteered to give up their weapons, as they were no longer of any use to them. More than 24 elephants have been born at Nkota since relocation. With an area of more than 1,800 square kilometres, there's plenty of space for the elephant population to continue to grow. Their presence is also helping to rebalance Nkota's damaged ecosystem and providing a sustainable conservation model which could be replicated in other parks. All this has been a big draw for tourism, which contributes 5 times more than the illegal wildlife trade to GDP, and this is mainly because of the elephants. There's also been a dramatic rise in interest from...
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet. Part 4. You will hear a student on a fashion design course giving a talk about the history of pockets. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good morning. Now, we've been asked to choose an aspect of European clothing or fashion and to talk about its development over time. I decided to focus on a rather small area of clothing, and that's pockets. I chose pockets for two reasons, really. We all have them in jeans, jackets, coats, for example, and even though we often carry bags or briefcases as well, nothing is quite as convenient as being able to pop your phone or credit card into your pocket. Yet, I suspect that other than that, people don't really think about pockets too much, and they're rather overlooked as a fashion item. It's certainly very interesting to go back in time and see how pockets developed for men and women. In the 18th century, fashions were quite different from the way they are now, and pockets were too. If we think about male fashion first, that was the time when suits became popular. Trousers were knee-length only, and referred to as breeches. The waistcoats were short, and the jackets were long. But all three garments were lined with material, and pockets were sewn into this cloth by whichever tailor the customer used. The wearer could then carry small objects such as pencils or coins on their person and reach them through a gap in the lining. Coat pockets became increasingly decorative on the outside for men who wanted to look stylish. But they were often larger but plainer if the wearer was someone with a profession who needed to carry medical instruments, a doctor or physician, for example. The development of women's pockets was a little different. For one thing, they weren't nearly as visible or as easy to reach as men's. In the 18th and 19th centuries, women carried numerous possessions on their person, and some of these could be worth a lot of money. Women were more vulnerable to theft, and wealthy women, in particular, worried constantly about pickpockets. So, what they did was to have a pair of pockets made that were tied together with string. The pockets were made of fabric, which might be recycled cloth if the wearer had little money, or something more expensive, such as linen, sometimes featuring very delicate embroidery. Women tied the pockets around their waist, so that they hung beneath their clothes. Remember, skirts were long then, and there was plenty of room to hide a whole range of small possessions between the layers of petticoats that were commonly worn. They would have an opening in the folds of their skirts, through which they could reach whatever they needed, like their perfume. Working women, of course, also needed to carry around items that they might use for whatever job or trade they were involved in, but their pairs of pockets still remained on the inside of their clothing. They just got bigger or longer, sometimes reaching down to their knees. So, the tie-on pockets went well into the 19th century, and only changed when fashion altered towards the end of that period. That's when dresses became tighter and less bulky, and the pairs of pockets became very noticeable. They stood out too much and detracted from the woman's image. Women who had been used to carrying around a range of personal possessions, and still wanted to, needed somewhere to carry these items about their person. That was when small bags, or pouches as they were known, came into fashion, and, of course, they inevitably led onto the handbag of more modern times, particularly when fashion removed pockets altogether.
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet. Part 4. You will hear part of a lecture for astronomy students about the need for a system to manage satellites and other objects orbiting the Earth. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
In today's astronomy lecture, I'm going to talk about the need for a system to manage the movement of satellites and other objects in orbit around the Earth. In other words, a space traffic management system. We already have effective air traffic control systems that are used internationally to ensure that planes navigate our skies safely. Well, space traffic management is a similar concept, but focusing on the control of satellites. The aim of such a system would be to prevent the danger of collisions in space between the objects in orbit around the Earth. In order to do this, we'd need to have a set of legal measures, and we'd also have to develop the technical systems to enable us to prevent such accidents. But unfortunately, at present, we don't actually have a space traffic management system that works. So why not? What are the problems in developing such a system? Well, for one thing, satellites are relatively cheap these days compared with how they were in the past, meaning that more people can afford to put them into space. So there's a lot more of them out there, and people aren't just launching single satellites, but whole constellations consisting of thousands of them designed to work together. So space is getting more crowded every day. But in spite of this, one thing you may be surprised to learn is that you can launch a satellite into space, and once it's out there, it doesn't have to send back any information to Earth to allow its identification. So while we have international systems for ensuring we know where the planes in our skies are, and to prevent them from colliding with one another, when it comes to the safety of satellites, at present we don't have anything like enough proper ways of tracking them. And it isn't just entire satellites that we need to consider. A greater threat is the huge amount of space debris in orbit around the Earth, broken bits of satellite and junk from space stations and so on. And some of these are so small that they can be very hard to identify, but they can still be very dangerous. In addition, some operators may be unwilling to share information about the satellites they've launched. For example, a satellite may be designed for military purposes, or it may have been launched for commercial reasons, and the operators don't want competitors to have information about it. And even if the operators are willing to provide it, the information isn't easy to collect. Details are needed about the object itself, as well as about its location at a particular time. And remember that a satellite isn't very big, and it's likely to be moving at thousands of kilometers an hour. We don't have any sensors that can constantly follow something moving so fast, so all that the scientists can do is to put forward a prediction concerning where the satellite is heading next. So, those are some of the problems that we're facing. Let's consider now some of the solutions that have been suggested. One key issue is the way in which information is dealt with. We need more information, but it also needs to be accessible at a global level. So we need to establish shared standards that we can all agree on for the way in which this information is presented. We already do this in other areas of science, so although this is a challenge, it's not an impossible task. Then, as all this information's collected, it needs to be put together so it can be used, and that will involve creating a single database on which it can be entered. As we continue to push forward new developments, congestion of the space environment is only going to increase. To cope with this, we need to develop a system like the one I've described to coordinate the work of the numerous spacecraft operators. But it's also essential that this system is one that establishes trust in the people that use it, both nationally and at a global level. One interesting development that I'll mention at this...
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet. Part 4. You will hear a literature student giving a talk about Victor Hugo, a famous 19th century French writer. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
The person I've chosen to talk about is the French writer Victor Hugo. Many people have heard of him because his novel, Les Miserables, which he wrote in 1862, is famous around the world. It became a stage musical in the 1980s, and a film version was also released in 2012. So some of us, I'm sure, have a pretty general idea of the plot, but we know much less about the author. Today, I'm going to provide a little more insight into this talented man, and I'm going to talk particularly about the home he had on the island of Guernsey in the British Channel Islands. But first, his early career. As I've said, he was a writer. He was at the height of his career in Paris, and he was very highly regarded by his colleagues. As far as literature was concerned, he was the leading figure of the Romantic movement. However, as well as being a literary genius, he also gave many speeches about issues like the level of poverty in his society. He felt very strongly about this and about other areas where change was needed, like education. This kind of outspoken criticism was not well liked by the rulers of France, and eventually the Emperor, Napoleon III, told Victor Hugo to leave Paris and not return. In other words, he sent him into exile. So, Victor Hugo was forced to reside in other parts of Europe. Guernsey was actually his third place of exile, and he landed there in 1855. He produced a lot while on Guernsey, including Les Miserables, and to do this, he had to spend a great deal of time in the home that he had there. This was a property that he bought using the money he'd made in France from the publication of a collection of his poetry. It was the only property he ever owned, and he was very proud of it. The property Victor Hugo bought on Guernsey was a large 5-storey house in the capital town of St. Peter Port, and he lived there for 15 years, returning to France in 1870 when Napoleon's empire collapsed. He decorated and furnished each level or floor of the house in unique and wonderful ways, and many people consider the inside of the house to be a work of art. Today, it's a museum that attracts 200,000 visitors a year. He lived in the house with his family, and portraits of its members still hang in rooms on the ground floor, along with drawings that he did during his travels that he felt were important to him. In other ground floor rooms, there are huge tapestries that he would have designed and loved. The walls are covered in dark wood panelling that Victor Hugo created himself using wooden furniture that he bought in the market. The items were relatively inexpensive, and he used them to create intricate carvings. They gave an atmosphere on the lower level that was shadowy and rather solemn. On the next level of the house, there are 2 impressive lounges where he entertained his guests. One lounge has entirely red furnishings, such as sofas and wall coverings, and the other blue. There's a strong Chinese influence in these areas in things like the wallpaper pattern and the lamps, which he would have made himself by copying original versions. His library, where he left many of his favourite books, forms the hallway to the 3rd floor and was a comfortable area where he could relax and enjoy his afternoons. And then, at the very top of the house, there's a room called the Lookout. Called that because it looks out over the harbour. In contrast to the rather dark lower levels, it's full of light and was like a glass office where he would write until lunchtime, often at his desk. So, Victor Hugo was a man of many talents, but he was also true to his values. While living in his house on Guernsey, he entertained many other famous writers, but he also invited a large group of local children from the deprived areas of the island to dinner once a week. What's more, he served them their food, which was an extraordinary gesture for the time period. In 1927, the house was owned by his relatives, and they decided to donate it to the city of Paris. It has since been restored using photographs from the period, and, as I mentioned earlier, is now a museum that is open to the public.
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet.